East analyst Halim Shebaya joins me now from Beirut for a closer look at that report, in particular from the perspective of the Middle East. So thanks very much for your time. How closely is this inquiry being followed within the Middle East?
I mean, it is followed definitely because there is an interest in seeing what the report would say about the US and UK invasion of Iraq in 2003. But obviously this report is overshadowed by the more immediate events of the last week, and especially the deadliest attack in Baghdad that has up till the moment around 250 plus lives people have been killed. So obviously there's a more immediate risk and concern with lives still being lost as a result of the carnage in Iraq. But it is quite symbolic that the report happens at a time where Iraq is still suffering from the post-war consequences. Obviously, what the Middle East is witnessing now and what Iraq is witnessing now is not just the responsibility of the UK or of the US. There are many reasons that have led to the state of affairs as we have it today, but there is no denying that the US invasion and the UK part in it in 2003 is part of what has led to the state of the Middle East as we have it today in 2016.
Obviously this is outlined, and it's a UK assessment, we should add, the occupation and the military failings in Iraq specifically. But how has the UK's involvement in the Iraq war affected the relationship in the Middle Eastern countries, especially given the fact that the spillover of the Iraq war has played its part in other conflicts in the region?
Yeah, I think there's definitely more animosity and blame placed on the US role in the Iraq war. But the UK does have a blame, and especially Mr. Blair, in terms of his support of the Bush campaign and the war on terror. But I can point out here that the interesting points in the Chilcot's report was really two issues. The first was his saying that there was no imminent threat. And we all know that that was part of the justification of the war on Iraq, claiming that there was an imminent threat on the international peace and security and on the potentially the UK and the US. But Chilcot was quite clear in saying there is no imminent threat, and this takes on an important legal dimension owing to the United Nations Charter with Article 51 that says that the right of self-defense happens when you have an armed attack. And the argument was that the armed attack was imminent, and that was a preemptive self-defense strikes on Iraq. So that was one very important point that was basically shattering the part of the arguments to support the legitimacy and the legality of the war. And the other issue really is when Chilcot said in his statement that the war and the military invasion was not the last resort. And that's particularly important because as well some of the legal arguments justify the war by saying that it was done pursuant to United Nations resolutions, Security Council resolutions that were basically that Iraq was in breach of. So what the Chilcot statement said and what the Chilcot report will say in detail is that that was not the last resort. There could have been other options that would have been pursued, and who knows if the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives could have been averted. And on that level, the view of the UK and the US potentially in the region, there would have been less blame on these two countries in terms of what we're witnessing today.
All right, Halim, thanks very much for your contributions there. Halim Shebaya for us from Beirut. And I think you made a very good point there in terms of diplomatic alternatives. That might be something we can talk to with our next guest. Joining me now from London is Chris Doyle. He's the Director of the Council for Arab-British Understanding. So it'd be good to know, first of all, Chris, thank you for your time. What stood out most for you in this particular report?
Well, first of all, I think that many had feared that this report, the Iraq inquiry report, would be some sort of whitewash. It's far from that. It is a very thorough analysis, a very detailed, long, of course, 12 volumes, into what went wrong. And it pulls no punches, really. It basically says that there was a strategic failure from start to finish, both in the pre-war, the planning, the way in which that the British government under Tony Blair went about articulating its case, the way in which the intelligence really didn't match what was said in public. And then even, you know, in the post-war, the fact that British troops weren't properly equipped, there was no proper planning, no real understanding of the challenges that would be faced in occupation. And I think devastatingly the ignoring of the intelligence threats that were given to Tony Blair, that actually the invasion of Iraq would bring about greater threat from Al-Qaeda and like-minded groups. So I think that it really is a seismic moment. I think it encapsulates all that went wrong in that Iraq war, which is perhaps one of the most devastating periods of British foreign policy in history. I think it's far more serious with much more long-term consequences, for example, than the Suez Crisis of 1956.
And Chris, one of the points in the document stated that the UK and the US didn't look beyond an invasion. So what would have some of the other diplomatic alternatives been in a situation like this?
Well, primarily it would have been to have given the weapons inspectors more time in Iraq. That is what Hans Blick, the leader of the inspectors, wanted and had always called for. And through that way, maybe we would have been able to determine that actually, as was the case, Iraq had destroyed the overwhelming stocks of weapons of mass destruction that it had, and many years ago. And I think that this would have allowed for any better preparation for conflict if that was to happen. But it's quite clear, and this report makes it clear, that far from really giving those options a chance, Tony Blair and indeed George Bush, let's not forget that the Americans are criticized very heavily in here as well, really didn't exhaust any of these peaceful options, and really, far earlier than had been thought, Tony Blair was standing shoulder to shoulder with George Bush and was going to be with him. And we understand that was the case from at least July 2002.
Yeah. OK, Chris, really appreciate your contributions there. Chris Doyle for us.